Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm Kristen Kay, and on behalf of Aspen Public Radio, I'd like to welcome you to our second town hall in a series on housing in the Roaring Fork Valley. First off, thanks so much to the Belly Up for hosting and to our panelists for taking their time this evening. Tonight, our focus is on what cities and towns can do to address the affordable housing crisis. We'll talk concrete details, but also what those details show us about community values. We are certainly one valley with many different voices, and we knew that tonight's conversation had to reflect that. So really, this conversation is driven by you. We've been soliciting listener questions for months now. Some of you have submitted questions tonight. And I just want to take the time to thank everybody who wrote in with a question, because it's a deeply personal issue, and that is really close to so many of our hearts. Some details: the panel discussion will last until 7, and after that, until 7:30, you'll be able to chat with the panelists and mingle a little bit. We'll ask that everybody leaves the Belly Up at 7:30 because they do have another event tonight, so continue your conversation elsewhere. This is a live broadcast right now on Aspen Public Radio, so if you wouldn't mind silencing cell phones and keeping kind of side conversations to a minimum, that would be helpful. We have boxes by the door on the way out to recycle programs and to leave comment cards, although we'll also collect comments and questions throughout the conversation. And we welcome feedback anytime at news@aspenpublicradio.org. Also, before we begin the discussion, I want to take a moment to honor Joe Coffey. He was the first director of Snowmass's Housing Authority. He served for almost 4 decades, and he'll be incredibly missed. Finally, I want to introduce the moderator who's guiding us through this conversation this evening, Aspen Public Radio's Allison Bektesh.
This is Aspen Public Radio. Thanks for joining us for our second town hall here at the Belly Up. And for those of you who are tuning in on the radio right now, this is 2018, so of course we are also streaming live on Facebook if you want to watch that way. We want to thank the Belly Up for being the host venue tonight. Of course, this is a great community asset, and we are very grateful that they support community cases such as this one. We've had such a wonderful outpouring of submissions from the community, adding their voice to this topic and writing in questions for this evening. Of course, we can't get to everything this hour, but we will try to get through as much content as we can, while making sure we add substance to the ongoing conversation, and I mean 40 years of ongoing conversation about housing. As a reminder, this is a series of town halls, so stay tuned. In the upcoming months, we will host forums on topics such as what the Mid-Valley is doing, the role of employers, and the role of developers. We do have question cards in your programs. Hopefully many of you have already turned in those questions, so we can do our best to get them incorporated as we go along in tonight's discussion. After our first town hall, many of you offered additional perspectives to me afterwards, feedback, complaints, the usual Aspen and Snowmass perspectives. This time we've brought recorders, so you can come and tell us what you think right after. So you'll see Aspen Public Radio staff with their recorders. Come tell us what you connected to, the questions that left lingering, what things you heard that made you consider something else for the first time, everything we failed to consider during the show. We want your voice to be heard. Tonight we're asking what our local governments can do to support affordable housing. We're going to be talking about policy, both on the books and potential changes for the future, real solutions to the housing crunch that we face in our community. I would like to thank the panelists for taking the time to speak with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Steve Skadron, Mayor of the City of Aspen. Hi, Steve. Barry Crook, Assistant City Manager. Marky Butler, Mayor of the Town of Snowmass Village. And Clint Kinney, Town Manager for Snowmass Village. There are longer bios for each of them in your programs. Tonight we're going to get to know them through a series of short questions and then get into further discussion. So without further ado, I would like to hear one example from each of our panelists of something that is working and isn't working in regards to housing in your community. And we can go ahead and introduce each of you as we go. We'll go down the line. Barry, I think I'll start with you. Barry Crook.
Okay. So what is working is that the community has a long-standing commitment to providing housing for workers and not being a community that rolls up and dies at 6 p.m. There's universal acceptance of the problem and near universal acceptance of the solution. For the city, we have a steady stream of tax revenue that allows us to be a developer of deed-restricted housing.
Steve Skadron.
Thanks, Allison. What's working, we're housing nearly half our workforce inside the urban growth boundary. And that's a significant number of employees relative to similar towns.
What isn't working?
We could do a better job with the capital reserves program we have throughout our HOAs.
And Marky Butler?
Good evening to all, and it's great to see so many of you. What is working in Snowmass Village is several things. Firstly, we house in our rental program, almost 86% of the employees work in Snowmass Village. The balance either work in Pitkin County or someplace else, but primarily Pitkin County, whether they're teachers or whether they're with the fire district or what have you. So we're very, very proud of our rental program as well as our deed restricted program. And there's different qualifications that we'll speak to later tonight. What's not working? I wish we had more land available in Snowmass Village. As you know, land is very challenging at best in Snowmass because of the topography and what have you, but we'll talk a little bit later about some projects that may be that are on the books.
And Clint Kinney.
I think what's working best, or one of the things that's working best for us is we are building a sense of community with our housing, and it's very important, including in addition to the workforce element, building communities, what we're doing really well. What's not working well, I'm going to actually say the same thing the mayor did. We don't have enough yet. We're housing about 50%, slightly less than 50% of our current employee needs. We're tracking right, but we're not quite to our goals.
Thank you all. I'm going to jump right in with some follow-up questions then. Barry, you say that the city has a long-standing commitment and is living up to that to house the workers, but I'm curious for all four of your perspectives. Let's start with Barry. What obligation do governments have to provide affordable housing?
Well, what we don't have is an obligation to provide a housing unit for everyone that wants to live in Aspen. But we do have an obligation to ask development to pay mitigation for the employees that they're going to generate, and they've done that quite well. Almost half of all the units created in the APSHA system have come from mitigation requirements. We have created additional opportunities for the private sector to pre-build that mitigation and then sell that mitigation availability to a developer. We have an obligation to enforce the rules that are associated with our program. And as a large employer, the city, I believe, has an obligation to house some of its own workers outside of the APSHA system. And we have 40-some odd units that we have built for our employees. We have rules governing their use of those units, and we have additional units that we are planning for in the future.
Do you have a perspective on the Snowmass Village side, what obligation you have to be providing this housing?
I think it's a functional obligation. I think if we didn't meet it, our community wouldn't work as well. And we've understood that from the beginning. It's a workforce obligation. We need to have that work. The market by itself isn't functioning to make that happen. And so if we hadn't stepped in, or the community hadn't stepped in to make that work, we wouldn't be functioning as well as we do. So it's that broad goal to make it work as a community.
Steve, I want to turn to something I hear from listeners all the time. You said that we're housing half of our workforce. How are you, or half our population, how are you getting that number? How do you know that?
Well, we had a study not too long ago. In fact, we've had 2 studies since 2012 that looked at that. So they've done both some surveying and some modeling. And, you know, we get the number that's roughly 47% are housed, 53% commute. I noticed in your information, Pitkin County had a slightly different number, but it's around that number. I'm confident of that number.
As Barry said, back in 2012, Allison, we had a housing summit. It was a 2-day get-together of everybody with concern around this issue, including the private sector. And we did the studies that revealed the numbers, various.
So we have numbers from 5-ish years ago, and that was from employers, and 3 years ago. That was asking the people
The study
in.
was redone 3 years ago by a different consultant, helping the Housing Authority do a deep dive review of the program.
Asking employees and employers where they live, or asking people in the units if they work? Both.
We asked both employers and employees where they lived.
And in Snowmass Village, how do you make sure that the people who are in those units are working?
For our rental units, every year we check pay stubs. We ensure that they're working the 1,400 hours. That's an annual check for our rental units. For our deed restricted owners units, we have them sign every other year an affidavit confirming that they're working the required hours. There's a number of other requirements they have to sign the affidavit for, but it's a check every other year for that.
Yeah, I think there's another large aspect to this issue of the housing relative to Clint's statement, and that is what is wonderful about our program and Snowmass. It's city-run, town-run. The people that work in the housing department know every renter. They go and visit them. I will tell you that when you get into the notion of someone cheating, it's known really quickly because people talk about who might be doing that. We really don't have a problem in Snowmass. It's a very minuscule and a very manageable problem, and it's hats off to the housing crew sitting over here. Thank you.
I'm going to go to a listener question. Adam Wibby lives in Carbondale. He asked, should people live where they work? And I would love to have all of you respond to that.
Oh, you want to go first?
If they want to, because what we've found is when we've done these same studies that the city of Aspen's done, we've found a considerable percentage of people that want something that we can't provide, large lots, other kinds of units. And so I think it comes down to the statement that someone made earlier, housing is very personal. And so if they can, then great. But there's a lot of people that might not want to.
And that's very true. When I was chair of the Planning Commission, seems like ages ago, we did a whole study. And it was a very broad study. And what we found was, and how we got to the 60% mitigation for Snowmass Village, was we did a massive survey of all the employers and all of the individuals living in Snowmass, and we found that about 55% wanted to live in Snowmass Village, that were working in Snowmass Village. There were two issues. One of which is if you live in a rental unit, you can't have a dog, and dogs are very important. Second issue was some people wanted to make sure they had a yard, and I call it the picket fence generation, which is kind of my age. The picket generation, they wanted picket fences and wanted to be able to have gardens. So that didn't work for them. Oh, there was one other thing. Their spouse may work in Snowmass, and the other person may work, or partner may work in Glenwood Springs or Rifle. So it was very, very telling, and that's how we established the 60% mitigation for development.
And just to stay on that for a moment, so I'm not hearing that they don't want to live in Snowmass Village. I'm hearing that the style of housing that they want isn't available to them in Snowmass Village.
For many people, that we just don't have what they want. So it's a choice, and I will echo what Clint said. Our goal is to house our workforce, because that's a value of our community. We embrace it. We really care about our employees, and we want them to be able to live and recreate and enjoy the lifestyle in Snowmass Village.
And Stephen Barry, either personally or on the books, in our kind of long-range plans, do we think that people should live where they work?
I concur with Clint's comments as well. it's a personal choice. What we can't do, however, in our community is to provide every living option that every suburb across the United States is providing. We're not that kind of community.
What we can't do, you said.
We cannot. And if the expectation is that Aspen should deliver a housing product that is similar to the one that we're all familiar with from the place we came, it's a standard we can't possibly satisfy.
You mean we won't have neighborhoods with single-family homes and yards for our workforce?
That's right.
Barry?
I suppose I'd like to live in a 2,500 square foot home with a quarter-acre lot, but it's not a reasonable expectation to think that every worker in Aspen can do that. But I agree with Clint. Not everybody who works in Aspen actually wants to live in Aspen. Some are driven by economic considerations, but some just prefer a lifestyle in a different community, and they should be able to do that. I do not think that we will ever be able to offer a housing unit to every worker that wants to live in Aspen. I don't know what that number is, but I suspect it's substantially larger than 45–50%. But we're never going to have enough land, enough money, enough willingness to add the kind of density that would allow 80–85% of the workforce to live there.
I would love to stay on that question. You said you don't know how many people want to live here. Are there discussions about finding this out? Who isn't in housing that wants to be? What kind of housing they would want? How would we go about finding out some of that information? And how would we find out what we could handle? If we have those numbers, if we know how many people want to be here and what style they want, then could we figure out, well, how to build towards that?
Again, some of those expectations have to be reasonable. We're going to build fairly dense housing in order to house as many workers as we can. So single-family homes with a lot is not an expectation that I would even offer to the city council to try and build hundreds of those units, even if hundreds of people wanted them. I think at best we're talking about townhomes and condominiums. But a few years back we did a public outreach to find out what was the income range that we serve, how are we serving those different income ranges, what kind of housing do people want, and as someone alluded to earlier, having dogs is big, but that's an issue. So, we go out into the community. We did that before we launched the partnership with Aspen Housing Partners to find out what the community wants us to build. But again, those expectations have to be reasonably matched with what taxpayers are willing to fund.
I think I'm not going to add too much more. I think it comes down to fundamental supply and demand. The demand for housing is very much there. The supply for land is very difficult, and finding the mix, how to actually, that nuance to achieve where supply meets demand is the difficult part that we all struggle with. There's no doubt that more people would take the housing that we're built, whether it's single family, studio, 2-bedroom. I don't think anybody up here would argue that. But trying to find where those where everything touches and where we can meet it all, that's the art. That's the stuff we struggle with.
It sounds like those people who don't want to live in Aspen or Snowmass are looking for more suburban style, single family homes, yards. But there's been a lot of talk recently about infill and making and increasing density, getting some of those more urban elements into our areas. Then you can walk everywhere you go, then you don't need a car, those kind of things. And I want to talk about how high density plays out into the philosophy and the planning regulations of both of your communities. Steve, you have a chuckle there. You want to start?
Yeah. Allison, we're in a circular conversation. Start talking about infill. The Aspen City Council just spent $1.5 million of public money rewriting the land use code to change the policies around infill, from infill back to protect the character of community. And these questions you're asking are really broad policy questions about the type of community we want. And they all tie back to the principles of the Aspen Area Community Plan. And this council, and I've said this in a number of elections, stand by the character of community. Our community plan is a character-based plan, not a structure-based plan. And we try to support the character and the characters of our community, where a typical master plan looks at structures and it's somewhat indifferent to the people who live there. Ours is quite different. If you look at a plan like, say, Vale or Lions Head and Vale, and it's a wonderful place, it doesn't speak to having residents living there, and our plan does. But you start discussing infill, it takes us back to where we were 15, 20 years ago. And infill itself resulted in a huge amount of community angst and a tremendous amount of development pressure that was evolving the city away from the special place that we all claim to love. It was a preservation of mountain town culture and our small town character. So we decided that our built environment was the priority over big buildings, and that would result of infill policy.
We'll come back to community in just a moment. You are listening to Aspen Public Radio live from the Belly Up. I'm Allison Bektesh. Joining me to discuss affordable housing this evening are Steve Skadron, Mayor of the City of Aspen, Barry Crook, Assistant City Manager, Marky Butler, Mayor of the Town of Snowmass Village, and Clint Kinney, Town Manager for Snowmass Village. You still have time to join us down at the Belly Up if you want to come by. So, Steve, going right back to you, community character is based on things like running into your neighbor on the street, everybody having investment, long-term generations staying here, and you're saying finding places for them within the town doesn't match that?
No, the makeup of community is fundamental to its character. And the vision we believe in is one that promotes a strong and diverse year-round community and a viable and healthy local workforce as fundamental cornerstones of sustaining the Aspen community. But as we're constantly doing, the community in general and the city council regularly at our meetings, we have a clash of values. We debate priorities, and we do the best we can to balance our built environment against housing our workforce, and environmental concerns against traffic and everything else we prioritize. So it's a constant struggle to prioritize the values. So now, and you asked the question, I chuckle because we're going back to where we were 15 years ago.
And that might continue. Let's talk about one of those clashes of values. We have a question from Bill Sterling, who I hope is here tonight. How do you balance what residents value, outdoors, small town feel, with building more housing? And I'll start on the Snowmass side this time. I keep my mic.
You're going to keep your mic. That's an excellent question, Bill. One of the struggles that Snowmass Village has right now, we're in the process of updating our comprehensive plan, and there's a value that we're struggling with, and it's kind of a split community right now. One is the rural nature of Snowmass Village, and you all probably are familiar with the rural nature of Snowmass Village. Doesn't have a lot of sidewalks. It has a lot of walking paths that are all interconnected against the issue of urbanization or increased density. So it is a significant conversation going on as we move forward with our revision of our comprehensive plan. So that debate will continue to occur until we resolve it. But one of the values of Snowmass Village with our employees, employee housing program, we're very integrated. We all know one another. And it's all about reaching out and knowing one another. And within the communities, employee communities, which are kind of a pod all over the town, those communities, you'll find a lot of children, which does create outdoor activities. We have many of our kids go to the Aspen Public School. I think we've got almost 300 kids now in the Aspen Public Schools. So we're very integrated in terms of the notion of how you establish community. So you can see a struggle, and I hear what Steve is saying about character, and that's exactly the debate we've got going on in Snowmass Village. We don't want a lot of density, but we also want to be able to provide excellent, affordable key employee housing.
The only thing I would really add to that is it's not a right versus wrong kind of question, open space versus density. It's a right versus right, and that makes it really difficult. That open space, no one's going to stand up here and say pay paradise, and no one's going to say we don't need to provide more of this kind of housing. And so when policymakers are faced with two right decisions, that's the conundrum. That gets really, really difficult. It's those competing interests that make this job fun and hard. If you're an optimist, you can't go wrong. And if you're a pessimist, you can't make anybody happy. And it's those competing interests that we're working through.
I'm hoping one of you will clarify, maybe Barry, but density and open space isn't the two sides of the coin. Density and open space are the same side of the coin, right? The more dense you make a unit in town, the more open space we save surrounding our towns.
Sure, but no one is seriously suggesting we're going to take open space and subject it to housing development. But really,
no one in the government is suggesting that. I would say some of our listeners are suggesting that.
Okay, but it's not a serious conversation with my council. The question about character is more about mass scale and secondarily design. I can tell you, as a developer for the city, I never bring to my council a development proposal that I consider wildly out of scale with the massive scale decisions that they have made. So as Clint suggested, those conversations are more at the margin. Should I have 4 more or 4 less units at 488 Castle Creek? Neither of those decisions, I think, would have produced something wildly out of character with what the community expects. Those are conversations at the margins that reasonable people can have, but we're not going to build 7, 8-story condominium towers that ring Smuggler Mountain, as has been suggested to me, as a free market solution. But that's absurd. No one's suggesting it. No one's going to bring that kind of program forward. These are marginal decisions that the council makes about, do I take 1 unit off of here? Do I take that 3rd story off? So again, I think there's general acceptance of the community character. The decisions are made at the margin.
Steve, I'm thrilled that Barry brought up the Castle Creek property, which you voted against the approval of what actually got approved, I think because you were in support of that 3rd story. And Barry, what you're saying is either way would have been similar. Steve, isn't it better than to add those extra homes?
I thought so. I support the additional density on that site. The rest of council, the majority of council felt otherwise. So yes, I agree with you.
And can you talk a little bit more about open space?
Sure. At the previous town hall, Christine sat at this table, chair of the Next Gen Commission, and I was sitting in the front row, and she said, quite boldly, it's time, something along the lines of, perhaps it's time to consider developing on open space. I was stunned. I actually turned to former Mayor McIreland, who I was sitting next to, and said, if you put that on a ballot, it would lose 80-20.
Well, that feeling that the humans who make up the community are as important, or at some point there's a balance that they are as important as an acre of land on the way into town.
That's a political conversation, and not one for Clint or Barry. That's for the people sitting in the elected seats, and that's for the candidates in upcoming elections, the next generation of leadership. And by next generation, I don't mean age. I mean the next wave of people who sit in these seats, to stand up in front of the community and say, we believe, or our priority is to build housing and open space, and then let the community debate it.
So that's if our community feels that yes, it is time to build more housing, while not sacrificing too much open space, that'll come out in elections. You're saying?
I believe that's where it starts.
And that was an anonymous question from our audience. Thank you so much for participating. Well, is there a policy then? Is there something that the elected officials can't do, but that the town managers here, is there a policy you can make that says, at this point we've reached our breaking point and it is worth adding more housing and sacrificing this plot of land? Is that in your code in any way? When does that seesaw tip?
The short answer is no. I mean, that is a values discussion. I think Steve's right. Those values need to be set by elected officials. That's why you have elections. And then it's, Bears my job to implement those through policy. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect. You kind of said, you talked about density and open space. I hope what we all kind of agree is sprawl. Nobody wants sprawl, and that's what we're trying to prevent. And by bringing density internal, then you can change the character. And that's the discussion, as the mayor, Marky pointed out, that we're having right now, is how do we protect open space, that open space feeling in the village right now. And it's a great discussion to have.
Again, we're not going to get to everything, and we're not going to get as in depth with everything as we can tonight. That's why this is a series of town halls. We're going to shift gears now. Got a lot of listener questions about the short-term rental market, how that's affected the cost and property values and livability over the years. It seems like something like that could be regulated through policy. I'm curious first, we have a question from Kimbo Brown-Sherrado. She's from Aspen. Where do short-term rentals and regulations fit into this? Do we know how many long-term rentals we have lost to this market? Is there any way to study that? How do we combat that? Go ahead, Steve.
Else, we're talking about things, the advent of Airbnb and
yeah, even Craigslist, even if you could put your apartment up once a weekend and get a lot of money instead of renting to a local for a year.
City Council supported a line item in our recent budget for our finance department to hire an an employee to study this closely.
A full-time employee who will study short-term rentals' effect on housing.
More than that. Part of the responsibility will be to study this issue. It is affecting us, but it's affecting us to a lesser degree than it is places like Crested Butte.
Who have absolutely regulated this at this point. Crested Butte has put in play people and places where you can't do short-term rentals because it's affecting their rental market so much. Would we do that?
It's a policy council would be open to discussing.
Barry, you want to add to that?
Well, I agree the impact in Aspen is less than other communities, and that's because the transition of affordable free market housing for workers to something else began decades ago in Aspen. So while we have lost some of that housing to second homeowners, et cetera, it began a long time ago. This more recent incursion of short-term rental market is impacting us less than other communities.
But it's impacting us enough to do something about it.
Well, it's not, you can do something about it, but those are big political questions. And there's a question of, even if let's say you were to outlaw it, how much enforcement are you going to throw into that to try and stop that? So yeah, we're losing some, but we have a multifamily replacement program as well. So that if you take a condominium complex that is housing workers and want to scrape and replace it, you have to return a certain amount of that kind of housing for the workforce. So that has ameliorated some of that. We're losing housing for other reasons. We're losing some for retirement, and we're just not keeping up. The workforce grows. I don't have the money or the land to build enough housing fast enough to maintain that 45% goal that the council has established for me. And I have a decent income stream, unlike a lot of communities in mountain towns across Colorado.
But it sounds like we're losing some of our housing on the free market, not just that we have this whole housing authority and maybe people are retiring, maybe people are skirting the system, however, but that we used to have free market options that people could rent and that's no longer available. So I'm going to come back to that, but I do want to hear what Snowmass Village is doing about short-term rentals. What kind of policies could you pass that is that affecting you, and what can you do about it?
We have not updated that number for a while. The last number that I've seen, we've got about 200 units that we think are free market that are being used for long-term rentals. So we have identified those at risk, and we've included those in our evaluation. And when we say we need to build 383 more units, that 200 is contributing to that, to our overall demand. We don't know that it's going to be, we're going to be able to prevent, we're not going to be able to prevent losing that. Similar to what Aspen's done, we've actually changed the way we collect on VRBO and Airbnb. We were the first in the state to start collecting to make sure that we entered into an agreement with them to collect the taxes. So we think we're doing a fair job on the rental market, making sure that no one's able to skirt those kind of regulations. But as far as preventing someone from doing a rental, I think we've taken the position that we are a community that has a large resort in the middle of us, and those VRBOs, those Airbnbs, contribute to that resort, and we've erred on that side, and we know that error is going to create 200 more units, and we need to work towards that.
And of course, some of the people who are putting their homes up on Airbnb and VRBO are locals who maybe can make an income that way because the cost of living has gone up for everybody. We used to have a system of ADUs, gypsy units, all kinds of names for those. Barry, can you walk me through, why didn't that work? Why weren't we able to enforce that? Is that something we can bring back as a government regulation where we're encouraging people to make affordable housing on the free market?
Well, we certainly have the legal ability to force a developer to create an ADU as a mitigation requirement. What you don't have is the legal ability to force them to rent it to someone. And so that's the conundrum. That's why it didn't house a lot of workers. Sure, they built these things, but they didn't want to put a worker into the unit. It becomes a media room, a grandmother's suite, in contravention of their requirement. Again, there's an enforcement thing there. So we decided we're no longer going to use those as mitigation units because they're not producing what we wanted. And in fact, we're going to allow you to purchase that deed restriction away so that it doesn't cloud the title going forward. And we'll take that money and put it into housing that can really house workers.
And Judith Goldberg, I hope that answered your question. Thank you so much for submitting that. I'm Allison Bektesh. You're listening to the second in a series of live town halls from Aspen Public Radio. Joining me here at the belly of Aspen are Steve Skadron, he's the mayor of the city of Aspen, Barry Crook, assistant city manager. To my left, Marky Butler, mayor of the town of Snowmass Village, and Clint McKinney, town manager for Snowmass Village. For those of you who are here in the audience, first of all, thank you so much for showing up tonight. Good to see you. The Aspen Public Radio staff is going to do one last sweep. You all have comment and question cards in your programs. We want to sneak those in through technology to me, back out to you those questions. So this is your kind of last chance to go wave those and get them grabbed. We will fit those audience questions in at the end of the hour. I want to talk about some of the other regulations that could come into play that would provide housing or make it harder for someone to provide affordable housing. We talked about ADUs and other lawsuits that didn't quite work. There's also mitigation when new things are built that either businesses or homes, you kind of have to pay into the fact that you're creating space and give someone else space. Can I just hear the kind of mitigation rules for Snowmass Village and Aspen, and then we're going to scratch into that a little further.
We're currently at a 60% mitigation, and that's 60% of the employees that would be associated with that particular development. But what's important, that doesn't mean that they're the ones that get to rent those respective units.
So if a new company is being built and they mitigate housing for some of those employees, it's not necessarily their employees who get to live wherever they mitigate that.
Right.
Interesting. So, and is that by, how do you know how many employees are going to be generated? Is that by square foot of the development? Do you have a way of looking at, well, this type of business?
There's a different, yes, it's by business. So obviously a restaurant's going to generate more employees than a hotel.
Okay.
So It's a huge formula of how many employees per type of square foot.
And do they actually have to build new units, or can they pay you off?
We have what's called the cash and move program. That is a conversation that is occurring now.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
What are the
Cash-
two sides of that?
Well, cash in lieu of, some companies can afford to pay you a lot of money. Well, do you want the money? We would pour that back into employee housing that the government or Sunrise Village would develop. But I'm all about, maybe we don't want to get cash in lieu, maybe we're gonna require it and move forward with those employee units.
And sorry not to credit Howie Mallory for submitting this question about the formula linking square footage of commercial space to the employees that are presumably created because of that. But Barry, can you fill me in on Aspen's policy when new developments come in? How do they mitigate?
Well, again, there's mitigation for commercial mitigation. The council recently increased that from 60 to 65%. Residential has mitigation requirements as well, and those are square foot calculations that I wouldn't even pretend to try and relate to you here tonight. How do you meet that mitigation? A developer can build mitigation. They can build it on site. They can build it off site. They used to be able to pay cash in lieu. The council has ratcheted down the ability to do that.
Why is that?
Because we have created a program for the private sector, again, to pre-build that. So we have what's called a housing credit certificate program. A private developer can come in, build housing, deed restricted, and in return gets a certificate that he can sell to a developer who has mitigation requirements. So that's allowed. We've had one developer particularly who brought the idea to us. He's built over 30 units. We now have several other developers who are looking at the potential of doing that. And that creates a marketplace for mitigation that a developer can go to and buy one of those certificates, then present that certificate to the Comm Dev department and say, I've satisfied my mitigation with this. It's a unit that's already been created.
Was cash in lieu typically the preferred option, and does that mean we have a lot of cash right now and not a lot of housing?
Well, again, cash in lieu has always been an up and down number for us. As council has restricted the ability to use cash in lieu, it becomes less and less part of my income stream. I think we're projecting a couple $100,000 next year. It's been in the millions, but relative to the housing rent and the sales tax, it's not a large contributor to the money that I have to use for housing development.
Do you have something to add about?
No, this credit program appears to be working for us. So we have cash in lieu, housing credits, the ADU, which you mentioned, which we no longer have, and then building housing on our website. That's how we mitigate. And we ratcheted down, as Barry said, on cash in lieu because we wanted the housing. We don't want the money, we want the houses. House the employees, so get it done.
So that would mean maybe new developments. I want to maybe just show of hands, and I'll say this on the radio. Of the panel, do we need more inventory? Is that agreed upon? Yes. Yes, do we need more inventory? I think that's a separate question for, do we need to be developing new inventory? But let's talk about some of the projects that are coming online. The question I got more than anything else was what's happening with BMC and Lumberyard, especially if we have money in the bank.
So I have a list of potential development over the next 20 years that's probably in excess of $350 million. And I will get nowhere near that amount of money to develop that. We have on the books now three properties that we purchased that are going to be developed in partnership. And that's going to provide 45 units. Probably the next thing up is the third phase at Burlingame, or a scrape and replace project at Truscott. Somewhere out there is the BMC development. I view that as somewhere in the mid-late 2020s, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is I have a tenant out there who's kicking in $500,000 a year in rent. I also have a council that has various times talked about doing a mixed-use development out there. Um, But at some point in the future, right now, one of our housing projects has a deed restriction that expires in 2031. So one thing I'm holding out is, will I need to develop BMC West to provide a place for the people that will no longer have a deed restricted unit in that Castle Ridge project? Although I can tell you that one of the things that we will entertain over the next decade is approaching the owners of that to see if there's a price that I can pay to extend that deed restriction. It's a similar conversation that at some point we'll have with Sam Brown and his Centennial Rental Project. So again, I have a plan to develop all of these properties. I don't have the money to do them all simultaneously, so I've got to accumulate money, do a development, accumulate money, and do a development.
Let me stay on that for a moment, because I've heard questions from our listeners that both say we're not getting any more employees to town. It's stayed pretty stagnant. Skier visits are pretty stagnant. So why would we need anything extra? I've also heard from listeners saying, of course we're growing, so don't we have to grow with that? And you're telling me that as that conversation is going on, our housing inventory is set to diminish over the next 10 years.
Right, I don't want to bore your audience, but there
I
is,
think that
there is
quite
something called the rule of perpetuities that I studied in law school, and the lawyers will know about it. So sometime in the past, lawyers, I think, misinterpreted the rule of perpetuities to prevent these perpetual deed restrictions. So for a few years, they did these term-limited deed restrictions. And they are either a date certain, or they right now depend on the health of Michael Kinsley. So many years after the death of the last county commissioner that approved the project, the deed restriction will expire. So I've told Michael, sorry pal, you're going to be on life support for a long, long time. So those deed restrictions don't start running.
For the developers.
So that's what happens. So there are some properties out there that have either that kind of a limitation on a deed restriction or a date certain. And I just need to be cognizant of what I might have to replace at some point in time in the future.
Thank you so much for everyone who's been submitting questions. We're going to get to those. One last topic here I want to talk about is partnerships. Snowmass Village, you're unique in that your housing authority is a town department, and that your requirement is that someone must work within the town limits in order to qualify, whereas Aspen operates under an Aspen-Pitkin County partnership that just says anyone in Pitkin County. So they're housing people who work at Snowmass, Aspen, anywhere in Pitkin County. There's also a talk of a valley-wide partnership. There's regional housing authority discussions happening that I want to discuss. I mean, I think they approached both of your communities and were turned down, and I would love to hear why that was not of interest to you. That's also a listener question. I'm so sorry that I'm not
One of the reasons why Snowmass Village is willing to sit at the table, but we don't want to participate, is we have an amazing housing program already. And second of which is we do not want to lose control of our housing program. And I could see some handwriting on the wall, because our other communities, Glenwood Springs and Carbondale, et cetera, really don't have a solid housing program.
And part of the, as I understand what they're looking to do, is to do a demand analysis. We've done that recently, we've updated it, we've offered all our numbers, we want to partner, but as far as the financial request, we did not participate in that.
And Aspen, I'd like to narrow that down a little bit more. You are in a partnership. The city of Aspen partners with Pitkin County. Is that a good setup? Is that the correct way to be handling our housing program?
We're starting conversations now, just general conversations about general governance, and seeing if there's ways we can facilitate a better program.
Actual governance.
Actual governance, yeah. As far as your question about participating in valley-wide housing authority, council's policy is currently to build only in the urban growth boundary. That's our commitment.
Urban growth boundary. I'm just saying these words back into the microphone for you. If you look into the microphone.
Urban growth boundary. And also we have a, as Barry said earlier, we have a dedicated revenue stream
Barry, what would it look like what kind of governance items are not working well right now, or what would it look like to change those if that discussion is happening?
Sure, that sounds like a question for the mayor.
Steve, what would that look like if we change the governance of APSHA? What are some of the ideas on the table?
Patty wants to ask a question.
Well, look, I don't want to go into, council has not had a formal discussion about this. This has just been floated as an idea because our housing program is maturing. We're 4 years into this. We've never taken a look at the governance structure, and we're at a point where we should.
Some things aren't working right now?
Oh, not necessarily. We just think we should have a discussion about the structure.
All right, let's get to some audience questions. Catherine from Aspen, what do you think is the best way to resolve the capital reserves issues? For example, affordable housing owner in general having difficulty with adequate funding, free market repairs and improvements. Capital reserves have to do with the fact that the people in those units can't afford free market upkeep, or maybe can't afford their mortgage and the HOA that goes on top of that. And so some of these units are falling apart. And I know you tried to tackle capital reserves a year or two ago.
Sure. Well, Councilmember Frisch has been working on this for a number of years, and I've worked with him on it for a number of years. A few years ago, the council made it a top 10 goal. So we had a lot of conversation with the city council, with HOA board presidents, and amongst ourselves about, is there a programmatic assist that the city could offer to owners of deed-restricted units to help with capital reserves. And we put forward a plan that the city council generally agreed with. The Board of County Commissioners did not like that plan. They had an alternative plan. And so we've now handed that back to the APSHA board to see if they can find another solution that is acceptable to everyone. So that's where we're at. We have a plan, they have a plan, and the APSHA board is now going to try and thread the needle.
And we might be in beginning talks of governance in general for APSHA, as we just learned. Snowmass, I'm going to call you out. Someone in the audience says it's inappropriate and unhelpful for Snowmass Village to insist that its workers only live in Snowmass. So I'd love for you to respond to that, especially for a town that has such seasonal swings. Can't you get people who work and live in Pickens County year-round into Snowmass and add some vitality of community is the goal?
The goal is to make sure we have enough housing to support the employment that we have in the village. Right now, we have to work 1,400 hours in the village to stay in our rental units and, like I said, in the deed-restricted units. I don't think it's unfair. I think we've established early on there's not enough housing. There's not enough housing, you need to prioritize. And we've said that we need to make sure that we're working towards the employment necessities in our village first. And I think that's been the priority since 1980, and we haven't changed on that. That doesn't mean we won't partner with other groups. APSHA has built in the village, the school district's built in the village. We're open to all those kind of ideas, but when there's not enough, you need to prioritize, and that's the tough part of those competing interests.
A couple questions from the audience have come in. I think picking up from what we were discussing, open space versus density. It sounds like that your answer, but I would love for you to pick this up again if you want to respond. The questions are, how do you know that the citizens don't want density? And then kind of counter another point that says, well, mansions are being built in open space, near open space, and by our trails. Why not our affordable housing? It sounds like your response to that initially, Steve, and I'll let everyone weigh in, is, well, if that's not what you want, vote, have different representation, but is there this unfair balance of second homeowners versus, like, do we let them do things that we say we would never let our affordable housing units do?
It's a county question, and Penny Clammer's here. The mansions that are getting built in open space is the county, and we don't. City of Aspen doesn't have jurisdiction over the county.
Yeah. Near trails. This is a listener question. I have it. I have another one to add on that, which is there any responsibility for second homeowners to be part of this discussion, to be mitigating in any way, or tell me the ways in which they do? And second homeowner might not be the correct thing to call them, but maybe new single-family home, free market developers.
They are in our mitigation rates, so when they do construct, when new lots are created, they are required to compensate and mitigate for those types of issues, just like anybody else.
And if you want.
And for us, they're paying substantial real estate transfer taxes when they transfer property from one ownership to another.
Right.
So they are contributing.
And similar here, we have a RET, which many of us know about, transfer tax. The other thing is if you want to build outside your building envelope, then you have to pay a pretty exorbitant fee for the number of square feet, and that goes into the housing program.
I'm sorry I got so wrapped up in just learning all night. It's fascinating to me. I have some solutions-oriented questions. We have 6 minutes to get through those. Other communities that have seen skyrocketing gentrification and property rates way back in the day, we're proud that we got this started 40 years ago, but New York City, decades and decades before that, started doing things like rent protection and rent stabilization. That is a legal, a policy level thing. Is that something that we could do here to affect the free market in any way, where rents aren't going so far out of reach for the people who live and work here?
I'm not as familiar with that policy. My daughter, who lives in San Francisco, is very familiar with it as an attorney, and she's just now starting to educate me on what that's all about.
Are we talking about that at all on the Aspen side? Is that something we would do?
Allison, Barry and I were just chatting, we don't even know if it's permitted by Colorado law.
And just to follow up one more thing, that's something you can look into, obviously. And then when will that full-time employee start who's going to be looking at short-term rental? What's the time frame for that?
Well, again, it's a finance position. They'll be doing some auditing, and I believe he's hired that person, so.
All right. Yep, people are leaving every day because of housing, which might be the final question then. So what happens if we don't do anything? I want to talk about the community if things stay status quo.
There is one thing that I do want to bring up, and that is I'm probably one of the strongest advocates for our aging population, aging in place in this entire valley. That continues to be a goal of Snowmass Village, is aging in place. And my goal is to continue to work. Patty just told me there might be some options in the future. A lot of people think everybody wants to stay in their home. Well, I am in the aging business day in and day out. Some people can't walk up and down their stairs any longer. Some people really haul a lot of oxygen tubing around. The point is that some of us will not be able to stay in our places, so we need to find options for other people, for the aging population to live, which I really do think over a period of time, as we continue to see the aging population grow here in Pickens County and throughout this entire valley, we need to find an option that is very flexible and affordable for those who need to move onto a different type of dwelling unit.
Thanks, Margie.
Allison, I would add that as long as I sit at the Aspen City Council table, I just want to say quite definitively that nobody is losing their home because they're retired and following the rules. So,
In ownership units or in any unit rentals as well?
that's correct.
Right now, if you have worked for 4 years before retiring, you're eligible to retire into the unit. So the only conversation that I've ever heard people have in my council table is whether or not 4 years is a sufficient commitment to the community, but not whether once you retire you will have to leave. As for the other kind of specialized housing that you're talking about, at the 2012 Housing Summit, so it's certainly a question that's ripe for reconsideration. it was generally agreed that the city would concentrate its development efforts on housing for the workforce and for people who are eligible to retire into it. And the other kinds of specialized housing that did not have a work component to it would be the province of the Pickett County, should they choose to go that route. So we have no plans to develop that other kind of specialty housing.
That's all the time we have. I'm sorry to cut you off, Marky. Of course, we're not going to get to everything. I think this has been a wonderful hour, and I really, really appreciate your time. I'm going to end on a comment that we got when we were soliciting questions. It goes like this. Aspen is a diverse community and has thrived because of its diversity, not in spite of it. Finding solutions to our housing dilemma will not be easy or quick, although we are so much further ahead of the curve than most other resort communities. It's a complex issue and requires thoughtful proposals, which should continue to evolve as the nature of the workforce ages and evolves. We're very happy to be part of that discussion through our monthly town halls with Aspen Public Radio. Thank you to our panelists and our listeners at home. Huge thank you to everyone who came out tonight to join us. I love how civically engaged this community is. That's why we're going to find solutions to this. We know you have more to say, so again, we have Aspen Public Radio staff members stationed throughout the building with recorders. They will hear you out. What did we leave out? What did this make you think of? What should our next town hall be about? Go tell them. Thanks again to the Belly Up for providing this. Kristen Kay produced this evening and did a fantastic job. Thank you so much to her and the rest of the Aspen Public Radio for helping out. I'm Allison Bektesh. This is Aspen Public Radio.